Welcome into the 16 Sports Extra podcast, coming at you here in the middle of July. I'm Jackson Neill, that's Sabrina Hoover. And Sabrina, it might be July 17th, but do you believe we already have big high school football news here in Michiana?
I know. It's crazy to think that our last podcast when talking about this news was back in May, the end of May, talking about the Rule 19 eligibility, the new rule here in Indiana. And I think it's crazy to know that back then, maybe we had some talks here up in there about maybe players moving and what that's going to look like. But now we actually have a list of players that have already, committed to other high schools. And again, if you needed that refresher, Jackson, of course, said this earlier, but, to look at our website, what Rule 19 eligibility really is. But we have some three big names. Of course, the first one, Tejon Bardo, going from Penn to now Elkhart, right? Yeah, Elkhart. So now it's crazy to think about that. Yes, that's the biggest news here. The Wisconsin D1 commit wide receiver. He had a great season last year for Penn, but it's crazy now to see that we're not going to see him in a Penn, uniform this upcoming season. It
is absolutely crazy. That was the one that I think. The reason yesterday when I texted you and said we have to do a podcast today was because we've seen a couple other big-time transfers. We're going to focus on three today.
Yeah.
Bardo happened yesterday, but also earlier, I think it was last month, he announced it on June 6th on Twitter. Micah Jarrell from Northwood, the junior quarterback, he announced he's transferring to Elkhart as well. So we're seeing Trayvon Curry kind of use these new rules, like being the first guy to use these new rules. And then also we saw Landon Hall transfer from the Lancers, the Lakeshore Lancers, and now going to Penn as a junior quarterback. He moved, his family moved. That's what he said, but still being able to be eligible because of the rules in Indiana. So the idea that we're now kind of seeing the first people use this rule, and you mentioned we talked about this at the end of May, and I think in that conversation we said something along the lines of, we don't think this is going to be maybe the biggest thing right now,
right?
But over the next couple of years, let's just kind of take a look at it, keep an eye out for it, and I think we were wrong.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, again, like other players that have transferred, let's just think about last year, you had to sit out a year. So now this is entirely different. I mean, we've talked about the whole Rule 19, but they don't have to sit out a year. They can go straight into it. So I think that's another thing that's going to be interesting to see, because not only have we covered these players, last season and, in recent years, it would be like, okay, they got to sit out a year. We won't see them in that uniform this upcoming season. But now it's different. We're going to see these players in different uniforms, and it's going to be weird to us to see them in a different uniform, especially players like Tejon Bardo and, of course, Landon Hall and players like that.
Of course. It's just going to be so odd. And I think one thing that, talking to people, this kind of came through in our stories, but it really, I think, came through also just in conversations we've had since this Rule 19 passed officially on June 1st, and since it went into effect on June 1st, was this idea of, okay, is this going to become the college transfer portal? And I have always kind of pushed back against that. I haven't really thought that's going to be the case. But if you go on Tejon Bardo's Twitter, the way he announced this was a graphic, showing going from Penn to Elkhart. It reminds me of what players post on Twitter when they transfer colleges. Like, it's just, and I think the funny thing, just to kind of prove that.
I was about to say the comments.
Go in the comments.
Yeah.
And it's all Wisconsin fans going, oh man, I thought, I had a mini heart attack. I thought you were transferring to different Division I school. No, it's just high school. And this is what's just getting to me that's really crazy, is the fact that, for Bardo, you're seeing Landon Hall come into Penn, and Penn, has had some good quarterbacks, but now he just had another one as well. And yet you're now moving to a different school. And then obviously we mentioned Micah Jarrell. It's just creating this kind of web, especially right now between kind of Penn and Elkhart in my mind. But I think we could quickly be seeing how this could create a web, kind of like college football transfer portal for a bunch of schools throughout this area.
And kind of going off that point with the whole announcing, different schools. And like, you're right, he had the picture, he had all the graphics behind him. It did look like an actual announcement to another college. So Wisconsin fans, I get your horror for a second, but that is crazy knowing that this is the time now, players are committing to different high schools. And now if it's Indiana, obviously the whole Rule 19 eligibility. So things are different now. A lot of coaches, I know we talked about this when it first aired, but a lot of coaches have different opinions on it. of pros, a lot of cons on what this could mean for their schools, really. And I think the biggest, point of emphasis that they made is this going to change, the atmosphere of high school football? Is this going to change how people celebrate? Is this going to change the stands and people, actually cheering on their team, because again, these are going to be players just like big names we just mentioned, but these are players that have really made a name for themselves at that school, their previous school, like Tejon Bardo. I mean, you didn't go to a Penn game last year without seeing him make a big play or something like that, or even hearing people chanting his name in the crowd. So it's like, that's now gone for Penn. Doesn't mean they won't have a big time player like that. Of course they will, but it's going to be interesting to see how Elkhart, kind of picks up on these players. And obviously Trayvon Curry now is, rebuilding and finding these big time players and having them come to his school. It's going to be big for his program, but also it's going to be like, okay, what does this mean for other schools,
And I think, and that's a great point. I mean, obviously it's obvious. Trayvon Curry is the first coach in this area, one of the first coaches in the state of Indiana to really use this rule. And I think probably one of the biggest coaches to use this rule to the biggest advantage possible, picking up players like Gerald and picking up a player like Bardo, a high Division I commit. So I think right now Elkhart is clearly the school that is kind of, that's kind of pushing forward. I mean, we saw this at the transfer portal. What, Ole Miss and Lane Kiffin, king of the transfer portal. I think you could almost call Trayvon Curry right now. He's king of the South Bend, Indiana transfer portal area.
Which is crazy to say.
It is weird to say, but if these are the rules, then you have to play by those rules. And the biggest thing though, when I look at these transfers, and I'm going to focus on Gerald and Bardo for a second here, especially they're both going to Elkhart, but this idea that one thing a lot of people brought up with this new transfer rule, and one thing I was really scared of as well, was this idea of, okay, there's a great linebacker at a smaller school, and they're good, but they're not that great. They're kind of middling, maybe a 500 team. Does that player then, who does a huge role for their defense, go to a big time school? And are we just going to see the talent funnel from these small schools to the big schools? What really interests me right now is that, obviously Elkhart's bigger than Northwood or something along those lines, but more so the idea that Northwood is a football program that's one of the most storied in this area. They were in a state title game just a couple years ago.
Yep.
Penn has multiple state, they are as historic of a football program as it kind of gets in this state. And we're now seeing players leave programs like that, big time players leave programs like that to go to, I guess, Elkhart, still another big school, another great football program. We saw how good they were last year. But it's kind of going from one powerhouse to another powerhouse, and less of, let me go from a small school to the powerhouse. So that makes it, that in my mind, that kind of makes it a little interesting.
No, definitely. And I think you make a really, really good point there, because again, like players like Bardo and players, just like Landon Hall and players like that, it's crazy to think they have so much talent. And of course, the schools they went to obviously have a lot of talent before in the previous years, but it's going to be interesting to see, okay, they're both going to Elkhart. What is Elkhart going to provide this upcoming season? What does this mean for the future, really, of Elkhart football? Because, Trayvon Curry, what, is it like his second year? Like last season was his second year as head coach?
Yeah, he's pretty
new.
A younger coach, a guy who's kind of ready to be like, okay, I want to make a name for myself. And what's the best way to make a name for yourself in sports, honestly? What's the best way to find success? If there's a new rule and people, we've talked to some coaches that said, well, I'm not going to use it.
Yeah.
And honestly, I don't really want transfers in high school sports. I'll say that.
Yeah.
But it's a rule now. I didn't really want the transfer portal in college football or college basketball either, but it's a rule now.
Yeah.
And at a certain point, if you want to win with that rule, with that rule in place, you have to use that rule.
Yeah.
And I think that Curry's saying to himself, okay, I want to build a program at Elkhart. I want to build something special here. I want to make a name for myself as a program builder. How do I do that? Let me be an innovator, and in this way is a pretty obvious way he's kind of chosen.
And he's already, you're right. He's already using it to his advantage, and you never know. Maybe other players, when we have this podcast come out, we'll have to make another one saying, okay, this other player just transferred to Elkhart. So we don't know what his plan is, down the line. But right now, it's looking pretty good. That's the thing. Really good. So that's the biggest thing. Is like once August hits, once the first week of football hits, it's going to be like, okay, is Elkhart the real deal this year? Like, are they making a big, they're already making a big name for themselves already. Like Trayvon Curry has already established what he wants as his foundation, but what are they going to do on the field? How is this team going to gel together? How are these players? Because that's the one thing too that I would like to point out is a lot of these coaches were either a little bit concerned, but also, wanted to see how this would work if new players came in. How are they going to gel with the old players? How are we going to build this team, on what you have right now, and then what you're going to bring into that program, just on all levels, team chemistry level, skill level, all of that. So those are things that Trayvon Curry is going to have to figure out throughout the season. And, obviously, with that first game of the season, everyone kind of looks at that as like, okay, it doesn't really tell what your season's going to be. It's kind of just like, okay, what do we look like right in the first week of the season? But again, I feel like that's going to be a big telling point for Trayvon Curry to be like, okay, what works, what doesn't? So
yeah, what are we, 5-6 weeks out from the first game, and now Tayshaun Bardo has to learn a new playbook. And obviously, these are, if he's going to go to Division I football, he's a very smart football player that understands concepts of the game. But the idea still being that I don't care what level of football you're playing, learning a new playbook's hard. That is a very legitimate concern. And something that I think people don't talk enough about in college, especially when you have a new offensive coordinator or something along those lines. But now thinking of high school kids, okay, learn that new playbook. You have a month and a half to do it. That's going to prepare Bardo, especially for the college game with the way the college is now. But at the high school level doing that, I think it could be really tough. But it's just going to be so interesting to see how Elkhart specifically looks. And this idea that, these are players like Bardo obviously was going to be one of the best players on Penn this season. Gerald was, one of the better players on Northwood last year. He got some time at quarterback. I know they had some injuries and stuff, but he was still going to be what looked to be, a key piece of the Northwood squad. These aren't guys that are just, backups that are saying, okay, I'm getting a chance here. These are guys who are saying, I am good enough to kind of play at a couple different schools. What school do I want to play at? I want to play for Trayvon Curry.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting to see that in all cylinders, but also at the same time, that was the biggest thing was as a high schooler, the thing you want to obviously be good at the football or basketball or baseball or whatever it is, but also at the same time, it's like you're trying to build the academics and you're trying to get to college level. For Tayshaun Bardo, obviously is going D1, but at the same time, it's not just football. Obviously schools with that, and then you have all the pressure, and it's like, I just hope that this doesn't, like the pressure of learning a new playbook, learning new players, trying to have this team chemistry. That's the biggest thing in this is like, putting too much on a high school player, obviously, but if you're going to go into a new program like this, you got to be a strong player to really kind of be able to handle all of this. So
of course. So I'm really excited to see how this works out. I think, and one thing we did talk about back in end of May is that once these camps open up and we go to the different camps, maybe we'll see, this, that we don't even know that players that are already transferring right now, they just maybe haven't announced it on Twitter, but we had to talk about it because it was just some huge news, and Bardo is one of the guys in the area for football this season.
Definitely.
But kind of transitioning off of that, we'll talk about that a ton throughout the year, but real quickly, want to touch on the WNDU's 70th anniversary because Sabrina, as of 2 days ago, this station has been on the air 70 years ago. And my first question to you is, do you think those anchors back then would have ever pictured us doing a podcast?
Oh, that's funny. No, because this was the coolest thing about you going through all both of us really, but you really putting it together, but the actual, all the archive footage. We look at the Notre Dame archive footage and that's already cool enough, seeing the black and white and how they did back in the day, but looking at the anchors and the reporters out in the field, the quality of the video and the way they conducted their interviews. There's so many things that have changed over the years, but the number one thing, everyone knows how special WNDU is if you're from the area. You know how legendary the station is, how many legendary people have come in and out. We just talked about today, Tom Rinaldi, obviously Hannah Storm, reporters and anchors like that are in big time things right now. But it's to be a part of that, to be at this station, to really recognize all those great people that came before us. It's really special.
Exactly. And you mentioned those anchors as well, but then also the people that kind of, stayed in the area, really made a name for themselves in Michiana, the Jack Nolans, Jeff Jeffers, Chuck Freeby.
Yes.
People that are just so instrumental in Michiana sports coverage. And I wanted to ask you too, the real question was,
the real question.
looking back through this, there's almost too many things to point out. the thing that was crazy for me thinking back 70 years is that was before even Ara Parseghian was at Notre Dame. Like that is how far back we're talking about if you think about the legacy of sports coverage
100%.
at this station. But even with all of that, Sabrina, when you kind of were looking back to all the archive footage, was there anything that really stood out? You're like, man, looking at that shot right there is just crazy.
Yeah, no, definitely. Okay, there's a lot too, and you just mentioned that there's so many, but the biggest thing, obviously, you know, I wasn't here to see this and witness her play, but Skylar Diggins. I mean, the local ties with her and Marcus Burton, obviously he's still with the Irish, but like it's crazy to know. And there's you could name any sport that like all the local ties here, like they go so deep, and it's like Skylar Diggins is, you know, probably one of, if not one of the most famous, you know, Notre Dame women's basketball player here, but also in the WNBA. So it's like crazy to know that she had a great career here for Notre Dame, obviously is in the WNBA. So it's like things like that make really, like looking back at this archive footage so special, because you're like, even though I wasn't there, I feel like I was, because you look at all the cool stuff WNDU did to cover, you know, games like that. And of course, you got to talk about, you know, Arike Gumbawale. She's still in the WNBA, but her game-winning shot, obviously, you know, it's things like that, and there's so many big things that have happened in Notre Dame football and Notre Dame women's basketball and Notre Dame basketball. But it's like things like that you look back on and you're like, wow, like to be a part of like a station that covered that, but also to know that even happened here, you know?
Exactly. You know, for me, like obviously you mentioned Notre Dame football there. It's obviously so cool seeing all like, you know, the number one, the national championships, all that coverage as well. I think for me though, the thing that really just kind of stood out was the high school coverage. Because thinking about it, I mean, what are we doing right now? Talking about we're right here. We got, you know, high school football highlights going on next to us. We got high school basketball stuff we'll talk about. We've been doing these podcasts and we're talking about Tayshawn Bardo or Micah Jarrell or Landon Hall, these kids that, you know, right now they're just high school athletes in this area, but you never know what they could turn into. And looking back, and especially when it was Chuck Freeby talking about seeing Sean Kemp play for Concord, and just back in the day, seeing someone like that, you know, play in this area, it's incredible because you look at that footage and it's like, okay, obviously, yes, the quality's not as good, but it's still just a TV guy with a camera capturing a high school basketball game with a ton of fans, and that's what we do on a Friday night in January. You know, that's exactly what we're still doing today, and to still see that same passion just throughout the years, the great players that have been through it's just something really special, and kind of puts into perspective each show we do here, and just kind of the legacy of what a local TV station, especially one like WNDU, means in a community.
Definitely, and it's so cool again to see like their high school basketball show and their high school football show. And by the way, Chuck Freeby, you look great in those videos.
Yes, Chuck.
just gotta point that out.
Someone's got to send this part to Chuck.
Yeah, seriously, Chuck, please watch this. But no, like it's just so cool to see how dedicated they were and still are to their craft, and it's just crazy because like again, there's so many anchors and so like we could name so many people that like really crafted this entire station into what it is today. And I think sports is such a big part of that. You know, all the things that they covered for Notre Dame football, you could name it and it's endless. So like just again, to be a part of that, to be able to look at the archive footage, I mean, it was just really cool.
And then selfishly, I wish that back in the day when Lou Holtz was the head coach, they used to do the press conferences here at our studio.
Yeah.
Notre Dame, can we get that back? It'd be really nice to just walk right down the steps and get to the press conference. That would be, especially on those cold days when they have the pressers.
Yes.
That'd be pretty nice. I know that's not going to happen, but
right. No, but we can dream. It's okay.
Exactly. Looking back at that,
oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, so it's just really fun to see all that. Yeah. But we gotta get out of here. Really fun podcast today. We're trying to do more of these, especially now with high school sports gearing up and football season right around the corner. Less than 2 weeks until Notre Dame fall camp starts. I don't even know how that's possible.
I don't either.
But Sabrina, thank you so much for this. Thanks so much for checking this out. Remember to look at us on TV every single 6 and 11 o'clock newscast right there on Channel 16, as well as online at WNDU.com. Thanks so much for watching.